Hi, I'm Jay, and Gen 1ers can eat my badge-covered shorts.
Hey, little buddy, want a ride? Yeah, whatever.
Depending on how far back you know me and the places I have been, it might or might not surprise you to hear that I love Pokemon. It was my first introduction to video games, anime, regrettably, trading card games, also regrettably, and eventually became how I got my start writing about games on the internet. That start came in 2010, and back then we were near the end of the 4th generation of Pokemon games. Today it is mid-2019, and this fall we're gonna get our 8th generation, assuming fans don't go controversy crazy by then. Pokemon Sword and Shield have had far from all positive buzz since their announcement. Long-standing features letting you bring in old Pokemon have gone by the wayside, and a lot of folks are battling it out over whether the things that are there in the upcoming games are of high enough quality to make up for what's missing. Sword and Shield, it seems, are certainly under the most scrutiny any upcoming generation in the series has suffered under before launch, and regardless of what you or I think, the fact of the matter is that none of what we've seen, the Nintendo Directs, the E3 demos, the battles with the new Pokemon, the setting and characters, none of it actually shows us what the wholeness of these new games will be like. None of them show how big or small the problems will be, even if right now they seem like they make all the difference in the world. I say this because every Pokemon generation is great and horribly flawed all at once, and marketing what the games are fully like is impossible. Talk about Sword and Shield and put the problems people have with them in the perspective I want to look at, I want to rewind all the way back to 2003 and the release of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Everyone's favorite games, right? Well, I still like them. Pokemon Sapphire was my first, so I definitely hold a special place in my heart for Hoenn, even if I can concede that yes, the too much water argument is legitimate. I think Gen 3 has a lot going for it, like cool new Pokemon that start to move away from Gen 1's aesthetic a little more, but as much nostalgia as I might feel for the blare of trumpets through a GBA sound card, Ruby and Sapphire did one thing that players very much did not like. That anger over not all the Pokemon being in Sword and Shield, Ruby and Sapphire did it first. I'm not a programmer or a game developer, or even a person with a truly solid understanding of how my own dang computer works, so I don't know exactly how easy or hard it would have been to implement the ability to transfer Pokemon from Generation 2 to 3. It was there in Gen 2, but that was when all the existing games were on Game Boy carts. The Game Boy Advance was different tech and that complicated things. Game Freak has come out and said it was a technical issue they just weren't able to get past, which is totally legitimate, but it still made a lot of people upset. The fact is, the generation before this was a tough act to follow, and Gen 3 doesn't really try to follow it. Something that I think really helped Gold and Silver was that they knew when to stop in adding new Pokemon, putting in 100 new ones instead of trying to double or triple the original Pokedex. This gave you areas of familiarity, like finding both old and new Pokemon in the grass and early routes. Meanwhile, the Ruby and Sapphire Pokedex contains 202 Pokemon, and of those, 135 were brand spanking new. Now this is great if you wanted a set of new games that felt largely detached from what had come before. But if not, especially when there weren't a lot of other generations before this, you might miss a lot of the ties to older times missing there. Things like the day-night cycle being gone after fans loved it didn't help. So, we have this set of games, comes out in 2003, and a lot of people either fall off quickly or skip it altogether, and man, I get it. But everyone's experience is subjective, and I was in the camp of those things just not mattering much to me. Again, I can totally acknowledge bad decisions on the development's part for what they are, but when I was 8 and my parents finally yielded and let me have video games for the first time, that was all that mattered. I had seen the anime and played with the trading cards for years already, so I knew about Kano and Johto and everything in them. And I certainly went back and played those, but I was also actually really happy that the first one of these games I played was a bit outside of the realm of what I already knew. It had surprises for me, the way I don't know if Gen 1 or 2 would've. And in terms of the new Pokedex complaints, I'm kind of looking at Sword and Shield a little bit the same way. Ruby and Sapphire disappointed people in ways that I probably would have felt too if I had been playing the series before that point, but as games, they're still bigger than those problems. And within that breadth, it was just other stuff that held my attention and kind of captured my heart. So let's fast forward a decade now to 2013. Pokemon X and Y come out, the first proper Pokemon titles on 3DS, and 3D battles are here. Before you could only get those in separate console games expressly designed for them, but now here we are. Surely, Gen 6 must be the most delightful of all possible worlds for the series, right? Okay. X and Y brought with them a lot of new things. Enhanced visuals, sure. A region based off France, yeah. But X and Y also brought with them the seeds of one of the biggest complaints people now seem to have about Sword and Shield. I've seen the videos circulating around comparing the 3D Pokemon models in Battle Revolution and even the GameCube entries to how the models look in the 3DS and now Switch games, and I think it's a valid point that some of the models in those older console games move with more character and life than some of the newer ones do. I think it's true, absolutely. But it didn't start with Sword and Shield, it started with X and Y. It was X and Y that had birds lazily drifting on air and a lot of Pokemon just standing around. These are all common arguments we're hearing now as the games find their way back to the TV, but when they did it in X and Y, it seems like no one really had a problem with it. I'm sure there were those who did, but there wasn't really a lot of dialogue about it. Hell, there was even surprisingly little dialogue about how easy the games were, how OP the freebies handed your way were, how lazy some of the game's major battles were. We're only talking about it now that Game Freak has done other things that people don't like. So, does that mean we've deemed those other things more important? Is being able to transfer old Pokemon more important than having fights look really good? It seems like right now there's a lot of yes and no from people on that one, and that's only going to continue until Sword and Shield launch. If all those problems we're talking about now also existed in 2013, maybe our priorities were just different, or maybe we have a higher standard for it now because it's happening on something that's more of a home console than the 3DS ever was. But the point is, no matter what the reason it took us so long to care, this is where it started. It started with Game Freak making the choices they made, and getting away with it essentially scot-free. I know these models weren't being reused then, the way they're being reused now. But if we're complaining about off-model attacks and pointing out lifeless animations, why weren't we doing that in 2013? I think the answer is that, again, these games are bigger than any one issue. Straight up, X and Y are my least favorite Pokemon games. I think Kalos is largely uninspired as a region, and it feels like a checklist of things what a Pokemon game should have. I think a lot of battles are disappointing, and the story is very tonally weird, and so on, but at the time, I was totally on board with the people simply celebrating 3D Pokemon being on a main series game at all. In a list of things to care about, that's the one that came out on top. Everything else slid down, just like Too Much Water did for me in Gen 3. Eventually though, even though I was in that camp, I still realized how much I didn't like about those games, how lazy so many other aspects of them felt. The really cool things like 3D Pokemon, Mega Evolution, the introduction of the Fairy type, those could only keep me going for so long. So honestly, after that, I detached. I played Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, sure, but then I spent a year and a half or so not really going back to the series much. And then along came Sun and Moon. And here's where I risk losing all of you, but I have to be true to my heart on this. If you want to know the exact cocktail of elements that comprises my love for Pokemon, I have to disclose that I really love Sun and Moon. With Gen 7, Game Freak had one of their biggest challenges in terms of what this video is about, how much of the full experience we do or don't know going in. The choice to ditch the traditional 8-gym gauntlet that had always been the uniform staple was a decision that really divided people. I definitely saw some people mad about it, even some people who hadn't played Pokemon in a really long time. But there were also those who always hoped they would change up the format and give something new a try and thought it was a nice, refreshing change. I was one of those. And so we found ourselves in a situation where some pretty big change was afoot, and for every person like me who was into it, there was someone else who felt kind of alienated by the change itself, whether it was a positive change or negative. This doesn't need to be a case study about whether the trials were a good substitute, it's just that they weren't the status quo. And after 6 generations of one thing, I guess we liked our status quo. The question in the case of Sun and Moon, though, was what total this change would be part of the sum of. You just heard a few of my thoughts on X and Y, and so maybe it won't shock you to hear I didn't have the highest hopes for Sun and Moon. X and Y had felt really soulless to me, especially once some time had passed, and even though the trials were exciting and the Alolan forms were a cool idea, I couldn't shake worry based on what had been in the previous generation. And then the day I got my copy of Moon, I played for 12 hours straight. There's something about Alola as a region and all of its characters and Pokemon and sights and music that just came together really seamlessly for me in 2016. If I were to do a whole separate video on Sun and Moon, I think I'd devote a lot of time to talking about how the region has character all of its own. And everything from the mostly very cohesive new Pokemon to the unique Alolan forms to the story and the writing all informed that. Sun and Moon world build with the best of them, with Gen 2 I would argue. Really though, the takeaway from Sun and Moon to me is this. I didn't play through the Captain's Trials and Grand Trials comparing them to gym battles, not consciously analyzing if one was better than the other. Gym battles weren't in those games, and I was there for what those games did have for me. I didn't get mad at what wasn't there, I was too busy enjoying what was. I'm not saying these things are equal to the Pokédex complaints people are upset about now, I don't really think they are, but that was the headspace those games left me in based on what was in them. Which, I guess, brings us back here. I didn't set out here to try and convince you of my standpoint on this whole National Dex debate. I'm not going to talk about where I stand more than I've already alluded to. I just want to show the distance between where any of us stand, from the people harassing the official Pokemon Twitter about it, to the people who are sick and tired of videos like these, and where the games themselves are. For me, and for anyone else out there like me, this whole thing feels a lot of conjecture without cause, a lot of putting the cart before the ponyta. Look back to Gold and Silver. Imagine being the one kid who didn't like the new Pokemon designs and so skipped those games, and in doing so, missed out on things like hunting down the legendary dogs, or discovering you could go to Kanto. The things that made those games special, the reasons we look back on them fondly now. On the flip side, imagine, or just remember, depending on your life, picking up Ruby and Sapphire and being disappointed that the day-night cycle is gone for seemingly no reason. Or then years later that seasons were a thing in Black and White only to never return again. And of course there's more to it than that. If you feel that Sword and Shield don't have the graphical chops to show for the lack of some Pokemon, that is justified. But look at X and Y's first trailer, and the couple routes shown in it. And then look at how those areas looked in the final game. Improvements did happen, and hopefully, unless things have gone even worse at Game Freak than we thought, they'll happen here too. So let's think about that. Let's say we get Sword and Shield this November, and there's been a lot of noticeable improvement. Will the people disappointed cease to be disappointed? Probably some of them. But there will still be those disappointed, even angry, that not every Pokemon in the series is transferable to these new games. And to that I say, look back and zoom out. Not having every Pokemon won't make Sword and Shield bad. That's not to say they'll be great for any reason, I'm just saying it won't and can't be by that hand alone. Gen 7 not having gyms didn't make them bad games, just different. Gen 6 adding a smaller batch of new Pokemon so they can introduce Mega Evolutions isn't why I think those games are sort of bad. None of the things I mentioned earlier individually is either. The same goes for Gen 5 having all new Pokemon, or Gen 4 playing with 3D visual touches, or Gen 3 not having the day-night cycle or having too much water, or Gen 2 being set in a different region. None of these things make their respective games worse, they just made those games more distinct. And now we can look back on them and replay them and see those distinctions. And when Sword and Shield comes out, whether they're good or bad, we can do the same with those. I get that it's disappointing to not get everything you want in a new game and a series you love. Believe me, I know, I've been there, we all have. But Pokemon Sword and Shield will not live or die by those factors alone, not in a vacuum. That's not how this works. The Pokemon world and all of its quirks and emergent storytelling and potential and prestige, it is all a lot bigger than that. And if some Pokemon being missing is what rises to the top for you out of all of that, fine. But there have been a lot else on that list too. And for me, I have a hard time imagining it being the one thing that rises to the top once the game's in my hands. I've been Jay, and I'm gonna go dream of a new Battle Frontier.